Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. I'm Brian.
And I'm Soko.
And today on the podcast, we have Tato Khundadze. Tato, welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm Tato Khundadze. I am a doctoral student at New School for Social Research. I'm doing my PhD in economics. And my research interest is development economics and political economy in general. And I'm really happy to be with you today.
One of the reasons we invited you onto the podcast was because I had the pleasure of recently reading this great report that you and Salome Topuria wrote called Neoliberal Lock-in, Why Georgia EU Free Trade Does Not Work. And so I guess for our audience, can you just tell us a little bit about um, what is this deep and comprehensive free trade agreement between Georgia and the EU, and how does it reproduce what you call a neoliberal lock-in, and what is that?
First of all, I would just start with the explanation of what is a concept of lock-in. It actually comes from natural sciences and chemistry and other technical sciences. So, to say it briefly, it's actually related to kind of multiple equilibria. So, we can have a good or bad equilibria, right? To give you a simple example, for instance, the keyboard we are using now, computer keyboard, is a specific, it's called a QWERTY keyboard, right? It's a specific design, but it's not the most efficient keyboard design, because there are other keyboard designs, other kind of structure of the letters on the keyboard. And it's kind of, there is empirical research done on that topic that if we use other more efficient keyboards, we would type faster, right? But since it is established and we are entrenched in this technology, we no longer changing, right? So, and then in economics, it was also it's also frequently used in macroeconomics as well. For instance, the concept of hysteresis is also related to that. When a person is kind of unemployed for a long time after the depression and after the recession, it's quite difficult for him or her to get employed, even if there is a job available, because people losing some skills, they are depressed. There are a lot of sociological kind of reasons behind it. Right? So it's just kind of two examples. And by saying that we are in neoliberal lock-in, I meant that we are in a bad equilibrium, which means that we have a specific economic or political economic system which doesn't enable Georgia to develop quickly. And this system was established after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we can discuss further the kind of what are the major characteristics of, right? First of all, I should remind actually to our listeners that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a massive deindustrialization, and the population of Georgia has decreased by 30%, mainly due to the massive outward migration, because there was a kind of lack of jobs, the industrialization, and also the destruction of the agriculture. Actually, in the Soviet times, we had quite efficient industrial sector in Georgia, and also quite efficient agricultural system as well, and it was kind of self-reinforcing. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, all this was sold as a kind of as a scrap metal for many years. Major export good for Georgia was kind of scrap metal, and then we are kind of left in this kind of economic circumstances. But this is kind of one aspect of it. Another aspect was what kind of economic and political superstructure we had here in Georgia. Right. So This also has several pillars, I would say, or characteristics. One of them is a free trade. Another is deregulation, right? It's kind of associated with the so-called Washington Consensus. And uh, free trade in the Georgian context meant that if we open up our markets, if we have free trade with European Union, for instance, it will enrich Georgia. And the rationale behind this was that if we have a free trade agreement with the European Union, all these Chinese companies and Asian companies and other companies from even from Europe, they move their factories here in Georgia. In Georgia, we have, for instance, car production, other sorts of production, and we would export these goods in the European Union. And then Georgia has signed in 2014, and then it really started working in 2016. This is called the Association Agreement between the European Union and Georgia, and the same kind of association agreement the European Union has with Moldova and Ukraine. And part of this association agreement is free trade agreement, and which means that Georgia can freely trade with European Union in general, generally speaking. But of course, it's a comprehensive document and has uh, some kind of structure which puts Georgia in a kind of losing position, I would say. And I can kind of discuss further why it's kind of myth and kind of magical stick, because before the signing of this agreement, not only in Georgia, but also in Moldova and Ukraine, there was a myth that after we sign this agreement, Georgia will become richer because all those factors will move to Georgia and we have well-paid jobs and iPhone production, car production, etc. Right? But just to give an example, it does not really work in that way. And one of the rules, which we actually discussed quite extensively in our research paper, is a rule of so-called rules of origin, right? And let me explain you what does it mean. So, this concept of rules of origin. We live in the fragmented industrial economies where production is fragmented. It's no longer concentrated in one place. For instance, if you want to produce a car, produce a mobile phone, you will not be able to produce in one country. So you should import parts from different countries, the components from different countries. But in the free trade agreement, we have this specific rule which says that around 70% of the produced goods kind of the origin of those goods should be from Georgia. For instance, imagine we produce a car in Georgia, right? It means that if we want to export it to European Union, 70% of the parts of this component should be produced in Georgia, which is impossible. So why EU does this? Why this kind of regulation is incorporated in the document? Because it's kind of defending EU market, so that, for instance, Chinese car producers don't start production of their cars here in Georgia and export in the EU. And it's kind of a barrier against those kind of processes. So this idea of magical stick is kind of completely false. Of course, there are no kind of massive inflow of investment in Georgia in the production sectors after the signing of this agreement. Moreover, I can say more about this actually. In volumes, in nominal terms, of Georgia's export to the European Union has increased. But if you check the export sophistication, which is a kind of a measure how well sophisticated your products are, how if there is a high tech or low tech, we will see that sophistication of Georgian export basket has declined in the European to the European Union. So
And can you just
Georgia
explain,
exposes
Tato, can you just explain what is an export basket?
the export basket is just what we're kind of exporting from Georgia to other countries, what is a composition of this kind of a basket. We call it in economics basket, right? It's kind of an export in general. It's a composition of export. So composition of export, I would say, is less sophisticated after the signing of this agreement. So we are mainly exporting in European Union kind of raw materials or low-tech materials. And if we again look to the concentration of Georgian export basket, and not only European Union, but also other countries, is kind of dominated by low-tech and resource-based products. And I would say more like 10 major products occupy around 85% of the total export basket in Georgia. And these 10 products are mainly low-tech and resource-based, such as copper, such as ferroalloys, etc. Right? So why it is important in terms of economic development? Because if you export kind of low-tech goods, it means that you are poor, right? So countries like Georgia and also Latin American countries and Africa, they mainly produce so-called low-tech products, and also they export raw materials. And it means that we will be entrenched in this kind of bad equilibria unless we change completely our economic paradigm.
How did these ideas become hegemonic in Georgia in the first place that would look at something like DCFTA and be like, this is a great idea? Like what are the conditions and the events led up to such hegemonic sort of neoliberalism, but also neoliberalism that doesn't even seem to want to protect its own economy, its own sort of sovereignty in that sense, or even gain the upper hand in exchange, right? Be at a constant loss.
Yeah, so since the gaining of the independence, we always lived in this kind of magical stick myth. I call it magical stick myth. Or in other way, I call it kind of a permanent passive revolution, to use a Gramscian perspective. So what do I mean here? Gramsci, in his prison notebooks, kind of talks about the concept of permanent, not permanent, but passive revolution. And the passive revolution is a revolution without revolution. It's a revolution which benefits only upper classes, aristocracy in the case of Italy, and Risorgimento, Italian Revolution. And I would say the Georgian history since the gaining of independence is the kind of phases or the waves of these passive revolutions. Even the independence, or gaining the independence by Georgia, was kind of a passive revolution, because this benefited only actually Soviet bureaucracies, and became kind of oligarchs in Georgia. And so we are, again, if we discuss the question of the Rose Revolution, I would call it the same. It was another passive revolution, because it's also kind of major beneficiaries of those revolution was not the working class, but major beneficiary was again upper classes. And I also believe that when Georgian Dream came to power, that this something fundamentally be changed. I had some kind of naive belief at that time, but it's kind of we are also again stuck in this situation. And if we look at the modern situation now, again, political parties are promising that, we'll be in the European Union if we kind of have a new government in Georgia. join the European Union, and all our problems will be solved. So this is kind of this magical stick idea, or kind of a heaven. Actually, Joseph Borrell described it very, very well, right? When he said that there is a kind of a hypothetical jungle and garden, and we in Georgia are kind of savages, and we actually believe in this idea of garden. And if we have a free trade agreement with this garden, if we had an association agreement with a garden, then we'll become a garden, and we will live like the Europeans. So this is a most problematic myth, and unfortunately, many in Georgia still believes in this. And I would say these false promises are kind of ideological instrument for local and international elites to control society, so that they live constantly or permanently in this kind of condition of permanent passive revolution, when there is an illusion of change, but nothing has changed. Nothing has changed.
I totally agree with you on that. And one aspect that kind of ties it together is that it seems like there's been a fundamental political mythology that became very entrenched in elites and sort of civil society institutions and embassies, Western embassies in Georgia, which was that if you have imported democratization, right? Democratization in quotes, because of course this is not necessarily some kind of natural democratization, but a Western-led form of democratization, that this is a necessary precondition to economic growth. But in reality, that's not actually how it works, not only in Georgia, but anywhere. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that dynamic. I know you've written about it before in articles about how does this myth of the necessity of democratization as a precondition to economic growth, development, or even maybe new forms of industrialization, how does this myth persist, and why does this myth exist, and what are the actual tangible concrete consequences of it?
Yeah, I would say it's related not only to Georgian context, but the international context. I would say, in general, international development context, how we understand international development, right? And discourse on this has changed dramatically in the 1960s. Then, firstly, we had the so-called stages of economic development. So there was a kind of a discourse that if we invest, if we industrialize our countries and industrialize, for instance, Europe after the World War II, that would be kind of important in terms of economic development, in terms of increasing wages and creating better conditions. And it has changed because, first of all, global political situation changed. So the Soviet Union became weaker, then new sort of new ways of economic development, or new ways of understanding, or new understanding on economic development has emerged. Firstly, it was a Washington consensus, right? The first version of Washington consensus, and was second and then third, which means that kind of the idea that if you liberalize your economy, if you financialize your economy, if you open up your trade, if you have lower regulation, if you have kind of no minimum wage, then at some point you will become richer because firstly you should sacrifice your economic conditions, accumulate wealth or accumulate capital. And when there will be a certain level of capital accumulated, and we'll have more billionaires, millionaires, and billionaires, and rich people, they start investing more and it will help your economy to industrialize. Kind of mythology is well known. But case of Georgia is quite peculiar. I would say it was more extreme. And if you want to really see neoliberalism in its pure form, I would say the Georgia is really the best place to come and see. And visit Georgia, because you can see, even not going into economic statistics, you can just discover by going to the streets of Tbilisi and looking at the architecture of Georgia. Right? But if you go even deeply, then you'll discover that in Georgia, for instance, people who work in the education system, let's say teachers, profession is of the teacher is the least paid job in Georgia. So I can say the same about the other subsectors of the education. But this is one part. The another part is the free trade agreements, right? Which we already mentioned. Georgia has a free trade agreement with the European Union, but also with China, for instance. Right? And Georgia also wants to have a free trade agreement with the United States. So, and also with India. So Georgia wants to have a free trade with everybody. And it's kind of a nonsense when you are a kind of small economy and basically you will not be producing anything because you will not be able to be in competition with global capitalists, right? Yeah, I would say like a Chinese capitalist or I don't know, German capitalists, etc. And actually, when I had a conversation with Georgian business leaders, they actually admitted that the free trade agreements does not bring anything to them. And the one thing which they emphasized was that if you want to, for instance, establish in Georgia a mid-level company, mid-sized company, you need like 40 million euros, right? Okay, then they can get this 40 million euros. They may have their savings, etc. Georgian businesses, right? But another problem is the risk. So risk which is related to political instability and also risk related to competition. Because when you are a small country with these free trade agreements, it's really difficult to defend your production, because in European countries, first of all, there is a large scale companies, they produce more, and kind of economy of scale really works, and they are more cost efficient. This is one problem. The another problem is kind of access to capital, right? So they have a cheaper credits. And third, they have a government support. And in Georgia, Georgian companies don't have government support. And in this kind of condition, it's really difficult for them to survive. And they don't invest in production. They don't invest in industries. They would invest more in, say, gambling business. They would invest in tourism and this sort of businesses where is a lower risk in terms of actually relocating your business, right? So if you build a factory, put there several $1 million, and then it's difficult to move this factory to another country, right? But if you invest in gambling, for instance, it's kind of, you don't invest so much in fixed capital, right? So cost of fixed capital and of the risk of losing this, it's really scary for the Georgian businesses, and it's risky to invest in industrial sector. So that's why we are kind of entrenched in this kind of economy, which is more tourist based. Okay? So what are the sources of Georgian kind of foreign exchange? This is a tourism, right? So when foreign tourists coming to Georgia, and then another is remittances. I said and mentioned that 30% decrease in the population, which is mainly due to the outward migration and people work abroad. Georgians work abroad, and they send money to sustain their families here in Georgia. And as a share of GDP on average, share of remittances was around 10%, which is really big for this kind of economy as Georgia. And basically, what we do, we have foreign kind of currency coming and flowing through remittances, through tourism, and through foreign direct investment. And I will explain later what kind of investment those are. And then, since we are not producing many things in Georgia, we're kind of import dependent country. So we have this kind of a cycle, and basically all this money again leaking again to outwards again, right? So we're importing goods, kind of a leakage. We are importing goods from Turkey, from European Union, from other countries, and basically we are staying again poor.
One, aspect of this very bleak economic structural picture that you paint is that Georgia may at times have growth, but you've written that, it has jobless growth. So what is this concept of jobless growth? Because it's interesting how the economic model not only undermines actually the elites to be able to become kind of like real capitalists, but at the same time, it also undermines the ability of the population to find gainful employment at home. So, like, how is the Georgian economy locked into this dynamic of jobless growth?
Yeah, so actually it's interesting to see, even if you check the last statistics, we have 6%, 9% gross GDP growth, right? So it's quite high and expected growth. So depending on which institution is kind of publishing it, expected growth is like a 5%, 6% on average. So it's not a low growth, it's kind of high growth if you compare to other countries around the globe. But we should actually see and check what kind of structure our economic growth, GDP growth is. So if we look at the major contributors in the GDP growth and take these major sectors, these are the four major sectors which contributes around 40% of GDP, and then see what is a share their employment in those sectors. Right? So they create around 40% of GDP, and in terms of employment, they create 13% of employment. Right? So again, if we see, for example, particular example, financial sector, which had 13 or 11% contribution to GDP growth, and then we check what is the share of employment in financial sector, we'll discover it's only 2.5%. Right? So it's quite small. It means that our economy is growing, but this is a jobless growth because we have an 18% unemployment. And if we say like 18% unemployment in the US context, it would mean it's a kind of a depression, deep depression, right? If we would compare and say this statistic, economists would freak out in the US, right? But in Georgia, it's kind of 18%. It's okay to say that you have 18% unemployment. And there was also criticism that this 18% is not true, and there is a much higher share of unemployment. But even if we look at the employment and salaries are wages are quite small, and we're lacking well-paid jobs. So what we produce is this in our service sector. These are service sector jobs which are less paid. It's kind of quite small salaries, and Sopon knows very well what kind of salaries are in those sectors, in these big hypermarkets or these hotel sectors, right? Um, and this is on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have a high growth rate. So it's kind of incompatible, right? And this is a kind of explanation. We have a high growth, but it's a jobless growth because we are creating our economy is mainly growing due to the growth of financial sector, construction sector, gambling sector, which does not really create well-paid jobs. Or if they create at all, it's a very small share of total employment. In terms of political aspects of it, and if we just analyze political context, actually NDI publishes almost every year. Actually, this is funded by NDI, as far as I remember, but this is done by CRRC, another research organization, Caucasian Barometer, if I remember. And it's a public poll, and in this public poll, they ask the simple question: so, what are the most pressing issue for you? And like without exception, in these public polls, the most pressing problem of Georgians is unemployment rate, high unemployment rate, and low wages. So this, and if we look at the political debates in Georgia, almost no one mentions problem of unemployment. We have a big gap between the real problems of Georgians, the ordinary Georgians, and it is actually expressed and reflected in the public polls done by Western organization. And on the other hand, the gap between the political debates, right? So Georgian political debates, they don't discuss unemployment, they don't discuss how to solve this problem of low wages. What they discuss is that, will we be part of the European Union or not? So they see this solution, and again, this magical stick that if we become European Union, join the EU, then this problem of unemployment, problem of salaries, and low wages will be solved automatically. So that's a major problem. And they don't analyze the problem of Greece, for instance, right? And all other peripheral European countries where they have those problems. Again, this unemployment, high income inequality, low salaries. So we don't have this kind of understanding in Georgia. We believe that European Union is a garden, and the only thing we should do, we should kind of topple down current government, and then we will join the EU, and all our problems will be solved.
It's funny because I was writing an article today and I used the exact jungle garden comment by Borrell in it, saying very similar things. So of course, Georgian, liberals are comparing themselves to like Norway or whatever other countries, like Scandinavian countries, than like they are to, Romania, right? And it's very wishful thinking. I think I've been saying this for a long time, I was invited on this TV show, like either last year or beginning of this year, to talk about the EU and, what we should look forward to or something. And they had different sectors. They had like a small business guy, and they had education and so on and so on. And literally everybody was like, oh, we're just going to get more grants. Like, I realized that it's nothing about, they already do, people actually think that automatically we'll have everything better, right? But really, I think it's more like what the sense I'm getting is the people that are already in these fields getting the grants to sort of reform or, enact those spheres, so that sector, are mostly looking forward to getting more money to come that way in supposedly the building of those things, right? It's not about actually getting those things, but it's about like their status, their class status in working, in the bureaucracy to get better, education reform or more small businesses, the tools they need or whatever they're justifying, they're saying to themselves. So it's very fascinating in that sense of like what they were thinking that EU is. It's just like, oh, more money. Um, and so they even had this one guy like post, this was so disingenuous, like post a French contract, a labor contract of minimum wage of like 1,770 euros and being like, this is minimum wage now. It's like, this is what you could be getting. And then they were like sharing it, like, this is what we're going to get. And it's like, I spent like two summers in Italy talking to Georgian migrant workers who have 25 hours written in their contracts for the whole week, but they're working 24 hours a day, only having half a day off to leave the house. Most unions don't want to really take them on because they're not like, it's too hard to even reach them in their homes and all these other issues, They're not unionized, they don't get benefits. They have to enforce any kind of breaks if law may say they have like 2 hours of break a day, but if they feel pressure, they will just have no one to defend them, and so on. And so you have these like two-tiered kind of system as well in the more richer parts of Europe as well, where there's like the sort of the local native population that gets like much higher wages, and you have immigrants getting much lower wages in all the different ways that they get around contracts and things like that. So that's just on like a small kind of like labor like level. And I'm talking about countries like Italy that has like so much diversity of how much they export and just like hold so much, power still, than like Georgia, which has, not a lot. So yeah, it's like it's become very like a religious thing, like they have, I think they like replace like communism with like, you're like EU. It's like, we're achieving communism. It's like we're achieving EU all the time. So it's become this like kind of like a
Bright
project
future.
person, yeah, that you have to be like always working towards. But I also wanted to add like, how does this discourse like affect the elections, like politics in general, right? So this has become so the fact that it's reduced continuously is pro-EU or against EU, right? It's like they don't leave room for complexity because then they can't get people out to the protests if you have like complexity, right? You have to be like, this is a Russian government, this is a EU future, and they're taking it away from you, right? So how does some of these like EU sort of politics play out on convincing people, politicize them, and also I guess ask like this, what does the Soviet Union have to do with all this and the sort of Soviet memory politics that we often discuss here on our podcast?
So, first of all, I would mention the fact that multipolar world is quite beneficial for small countries like Georgia. And it's really important since I said that, unfortunately, when this bipolar system collapsed, the discourse on economic development also has changed. And if before the United States was paying more attention industrializing the partner countries like European Union, like Europe after the World War II, through Marshall Plan, through massive investment in public infrastructure and massive industrialization projects, then after the collapse of the Soviet Union and actually after weakening of the Soviet Union, has changed. And now the US aid to those countries, small countries like Georgia, it's quite cheap, I would say. It's mainly based on so-called NGO grants. And through these NGO grants, you can just bribe political elites And usually the United States no longer cares about the industrialization of Georgia, for instance, to compete with communism and to kind of spread of communism, right? So there is no any worry about this any longer. So unfortunately, we are in this kind of situation. And if we have a multipolar world, if there will be a stronger China, stronger Russia, then maybe, since we are the partner of the United States, and they will think more and invest more in Georgia, to think very kind of selfishly in this case, right? We're a small country. We have a problem of survival. So we need to bargain with those big powers, right? Which means that for instance, if the United States wants us to be its ally, then it means that instead of giving like a small grants for so-called democratization and so-called human rights, it would be more important to give money specifically to invest in Georgia and so that Georgia industrializes and starts producing goods. And so we have factories and so we have well-paid jobs, right? So if the United States doesn't want to do that, then there is a China maybe, and we can have a better relationship with China. So this competition between this big power is really important for the small countries like Georgia, so that maybe in this case the actual discourse again will reshape and we'll have a new discourse on it. But unfortunately, in Georgia, we don't understand this, as I would say, when I say we, like I say in academia, for instance, mainly are based on these fake discourses. So in Georgia, in Georgian academy, the situation is again based on these fake narratives that Georgia becomes the European Union and then everything will be changed. There will be a friend of the US and Russia is the enemy. And China, again, China also became an enemy. And these kind of very naive, fake, I would say, narratives. So the problem of self-interest is kind of missing in Georgian political context. So um, Georgian academic in general, if we generalize it, thinks in terms of a black and white system, right? So we have a bad guys and good guys wants to help Georgia, and bad guys want to destroy Georgia. So it's very simplistic understanding, and in this case, bad guys are Russians and Chinese. And this really kind of affects also political decision making because we are kind of captivated in this naive discourse, and there is a problem of kind of analytical thinking in young people in terms of how we see the future of Georgia. Since most of the people in Georgian academia is kind of brainwashed, then also this affects the problem of critical thinking of young people in Georgia and so-called Gen Z, which also thinks in terms of those kind of categories. And because they don't know other schools of international relations, for instance, right? Realist School of International Relations, which talks about self-interest and maximization of power and alliances and kind of strengthening national identity and in those categories. So we are kind of missing this kind of debates, and our debates are mainly located and mainly concentrated on this kind of a false discourse or false dichotomy between the West and the North.
How exactly in Georgia do you see this ideological reproduction of these discourses happening? Like, how does that happen so deeply? And how is it and why is it so entrenched? because obviously we can talk about the story of where these ideas came from, how they affected policy making. But I mean, why is it that this kind of um, reductive thinking about, west is good and north or east is not good, and we need to analyze every single question through that? Like, how does this get reproduced in a country like Georgia? Is this simply just, the fact that people who came into academia speak this way? Is it because of the ties with, certain, I don't know, institutions in the West? Or is there a deeper structural problem that kind of underwrites it?
So a couple of years ago, who is my friend, he's also a professor at Georgian American University, Bakar Perekashvili. We wrote a short piece, and this is called, if I remember it correctly, Defenders of Neoliberal Order. And we actually outlined and described are those defenders of neoliberal order. And we analyzed this, and we said that he said those are mainly media and non-governmental organizations, which are kind of producing and reproducing these kind of false narratives. It's not only in false, but it's also kind of a very naive understanding of global order, right? So bad guys and good guys. And they are getting money from the international financial institutions, from the different embassies, from different foreign kind of organizations, so that it's kind of a really inexpensive way to control public discourse in Georgia and to control politics in Georgia. So you don't need to invest and invest in factories. You don't need to invest and create a big enterprises in Georgia. It's like an old way of doing things, right? When Americans were afraid of spreading communism in Europe, so they were forced to help Germany to establish a German Development Bank, for instance, KfW, and through KfW, industrialize Germany. You don't need to do it in Georgia. You have a less expensive instruments. You are kind of you're spending a couple of $1 million on non-governmental organizations, on media organizations, and they create this procedure of control. Now, in terms of structure of this control, is organized in the following. They are watchdogs. So it means that if you say something critical about the West, if you say something opposing, you oppose some policies of the West in Georgia, then immediately you are proclaimed as a Kremlin agent. So you are demonized and criticized, and you are kind of left beyond the kind of public discourse. You are kind of marginalized. And this is a very strong instrument because this really affects young people. For instance, if you are in the academia, if you work, let's say, in media, you can't say anything negative about West and anything negative about the policies of the United States. And I lived a couple of years in the United States, and actually there are some things that Americans are criticizing, right? So it's allowed in the United States to have a debate on these policies of the West. Why we are not allowed to say something critical about the West, right? So this is kind of problematic. For instance, we had a company in Georgia which had kind of bad policies, bad employment policies, and this was an American company which didn't pay salaries and wages to Georgian workers for many, many months. And if you would criticize this American company, then it would be again proclaimed as and declared as a Russian agent and Russian asset, when it has nothing to do with Russia, right? And that's how the public discourse is controlled. It's controlled through non-governmental organizations, through media, and this money is flowing from the West. And actually, not only non-governmental organizations and media, but also the universities now. The universities are also controlled by so-called defenders of neoliberalism in Georgia. So if you criticize market economy, if you see some flaws in it, then this means that you are a communist, and it means that you are labeled again as a pro-Putin. If you say something that, if you say that we need the industrialization in Georgia, if you say that we need more regulation, then you are at risk to be labeled as a pro-Russian when it has nothing to do with Russia. You know that there is huge problems in Russia in terms of labor rights, for instance, right? And Russia is not the same as Soviet Union. As for the Sopo's question, how all these are actually related to Soviet Union and Soviet heritage. So in Georgia, we don't have a conversation and debates about Soviet Union. The only thing is what's happening now is a demonization. So we don't have a public conversation, discussion. The only thing which is discussed is the Soviet repression during the Soviet times. So we don't discuss the positive sides of Soviet. So there was bad and good things. Right? For instance, there were some negative sides, and many people suffered from it. And many families, including my family, my great-grandfather was a social democrat who was sent in Gulag in 1930s. So our family was also traumatized with this, but this doesn't mean that we don't need to kind of discuss the positive sides. And if we read the even Western literature, we discovered there that there were some kind of fascinating stories about fast economic growth of the Soviet Union from 1917 up until 1970, actually. It was the fastest growing economy after Japan, like a 5% growth. And during Stalin's era, we had, in some periods, we had 9% and 11% growth, GDP growth. And it was kind of a massive emancipatory project to some extent as well. Because if you look at the statistics, life expectancy in Georgia was quite kind of short before the October Revolution, maybe like a 43 years, depending which statistics we use.
Yeah, it was 32.
Yeah, so depending which statistics we use, yeah, it was quite low. And then, like in quite short period, so it was maybe the last statistic which I remember. Basically, after the World War II, life expectancy has increased and it's reached something like 65 years. This is one. The another was it was emancipatory project also in terms of education system. In Georgia, before October Revolution, literacy rate was quite small. If we take the region like Korea, I'm not sure if our international listeners know this, but it's kind of one region of Georgia. The literacy rate, it was the highest in Georgia, it was 70%. And in another region, which is bigger, much bigger, the Kakheti region, it was around 30%. literacy rate. So people were mostly literate. And it needed maybe 20 years. And in 20 years, this literacy rate almost reached 100%. And and also it's related to question of health. And in many international schools, even in the United States, the health policy of the Soviet Union, specifically the kind of how Soviet Union tackled different sort of viruses and epidemics, is still studied. What kind of health policies Soviet Union used to eradicate this kind of health problem. But in Georgia, we don't have this kind of conversation, and it's really hinders our kind of understanding, and also it also contributed how we treated all the Soviet heritage which we inherited, right? All these factories, because these factories were kind of portrayed in Georgia as a bad thing, and we kind of destroyed it and sold as a scrap metal, and now we are deindustrialized, and that's a huge problem.
So how does the sort of anti-Soviet policies impact the policies that are adopted now?
These anti-Soviet policies is also related to anti-Russian policies. So in a Georgian academia and in non-governmental sector, in public discourse in general, Russia and Soviet Union are kind of the same. They don't see any difference because of I don't know, maybe lack of education, or they didn't proper analysis of the Soviet system and Russian system, which is completely different. And now it really affects because we are in this naive position that we blame in everything that happens in Georgia to Russia. So if we have a bad economic conditions, it's the fault of Russia. If we have a high unemployment, this is because we have problems. So it's kind of a very naive and childish position of Georgian political elites. And to some extent, it's also reinforced by Western funding of the universities and how they do the so-called memory studies. For them, the memory studies is just kind of analyzing how many people died during the Soviet times, during these repressions. That's how they see the Soviet Union. They don't see what kind of benefits it had for Georgian society, and kind of creating this kind of illusions. And the whole system now affects our political discourse today. So we are kind of still based on this childish discourses of 1990s of our political forces, which we had before the gaining of the independence. Was we had Gamsahudia, Merab Kostava, and others. So who said that, oh, the major thing for Georgia is to gain independence. And when there was a question, how we can survive, what kind of economy we should have, then we said, oh, it's not important to discuss it. It's not an issue. First thing is have an independence, and once we are independent, we can survive by producing borjomi and some fruits. And when there was a case when Georgia kind of organized the embargo, or the embargo on Russia, and then kind of if they don't drink Georgian borjomi, kind of mineral water, if they don't eat Georgian fruits, then Russians really die those goods. So we have this kind of naive economic perspective, and unfortunately it's still persists and it still exists. If we just to go back to our kind of major topic, which we started, even today, if we take major export destinations, around 68% comes on the CIS countries. These are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. And it's around maybe 20-25% comes on the countries of the European Union. So even today, kind of major export destination for Georgian goods are those post-Soviet countries. And it's not about the politics, it's about the kind of geography. Those countries are our neighbors. So it means that we should somehow find some pragmatic way to coexist with it. Otherwise, we will be always left on this kind of a dichotomy, and we will be always kind of entrenched on and becoming a kind of a proxy of one big power against another, which is really dangerous. And the situation of Ukraine really shown us this, that we may again, after all these years, again, kind of turn into an abyss. Kind of, our situation may become an abyss, as Ukrainian sociologist Volodymyr Ishchenko once mentioned. Actually, he wrote a book about this, how Ukraine became an abyss and how Maidan revolution became an abyss. So we should not play these stupid games, and we should learn from our mistakes, and we should learn from the mistakes of Ukraine, which means that again, we should not be part of the kind of Russian periphery. We should not try and strive to become a Russian colony again, etc. Actually, it doesn't depend on us, but it also doesn't mean that we should become a proxy for the United States or for the European Union, so that then it will lead us to Ukrainization of Georgia. So we should find a kind of our own way when this, instead of as a place of confrontation, we become a place for cooperation or among big empires. I know this is difficult, but at the same time, we don't have any other choice, because if we become a proxy, it means the destruction of Georgia. And we see the example of Ukraine and how the West, how the European Union could not manage to defend Ukraine. And fortunately, I hope that we'll avoid these mistakes.
I totally agree that this kind of pragmatism to avoid becoming a proxy is like a very important. And you mentioned that Georgia becoming a place of cooperation, not becoming a proxy. And I think it's also really important that, Georgia has this way that it can actually show a different way of being geopolitically. Many countries could actually learn from this kind of like stance that Georgia has taken to sort of like not become a proxy and sort of like avoid this like hyper geopoliticization that could then result in what you said was this like Ukrainianization or destruction of Georgia based on these like great power conflicts. And so I think it's actually something to be proud of, that it could be a way of like showing that there is a different sort of stance that a country can take in these rapidly polarizing like geopolitical conditions. So I think it's actually something that's like almost like Georgia could teach a good lesson to other countries. But that aside, we've talked about the kind of bleak economic conditions and the very bleak kind of political situation in Georgia. But I guess what I'm curious about is what kind of politics does Georgia need, in your opinion, to kind of change the situation, either in terms of hard economic policy or like social mobilizations? What kind of politics need to be put forward to change Georgia's economic and political and maybe even geopolitical situation?
Actually, no. We can start with an economic part, the economic component of it. We discuss it extensively in our paper. And the major thing what Georgia should do is starting thinking about, again, reindustrialization of Georgia, so that avoiding to put the kind of major focus on tourism and this kind of speculative and I will. So actually, we discussed this question quite extensively in our paper. What kind of policies Georgia should pursue, and the major component of the economic policy should be reindustrialization of this country. So we should put and kind of understand what are our advantages in current situation. Even we can use existing free trade agreements to modify it or kind of to adjust with that and design specific investment policies. And I'll give you one example. Today, our investment policy is that we are open to investments, to any investment. Would it be a gambling investment, in gambling business, would it be in tourism, and all other sectors like in construction, etc. So we need a specific investment policy which will pay more attention on which directions the investments will be made, right? We should prioritize those sectors which creates higher value added and which is based on basically on kind of increasing returns. And those sectors are kind of already revealed, right? For instance, during this Soviet time, we had steel industry. We had already, actually, we have these ferroalloys, and we need to think how we can use already existing industries to create new industries and link those and cluster it together so that we become exporter of not raw materials, but exporter of already kind of produced materials. This is very important. This is in terms of the industrialization. Second part is related to development bank. Unfortunately, today we have a problem with access to capital. The kind of interest rates are pretty high in Georgia because of the risk premium, because of the oligopoly of Georgian banking sector. So we need the so-called patient money, so long-term money. And this kind of experience already exists. For instance, in Germany, I mentioned the experience of KfW, German Development Bank, which even today invests a lot in decarbonization and green industrialization of Germany. So we need this sort of development bank in Georgia, which will kind of issue credit to Georgian entrepreneurs who are interested in producing goods and exporting it abroad. So I emphasize the export because we are a small country. With 3.7 million people. If we live in the last census, it was done actually 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So we can't rely solely on Georgian kind of market. So we need the foreign markets as well. So it doesn't mean that we should be concentrated on any specific markets. We have a niche market in our neighborhood, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. Those people already know our products, are familiar with it, but we can also seek to use already existing agreements with the European Union and start kind of investing in those goods which benefit actually a Georgian economy, right? So one way of doing this would be kind of establishing joint ventures even with European companies, so that we start producing goods in Georgia and exporting in European Union. And if our government was wise enough, then in terms of just signing this agreement, which is only beneficial for the European Union, they would think more how we should design our industrial policy and investment policy, and how we can bargain with the European Union so that they enable us to export our goods goods there. And this is important in terms of changing and amending and updating the existing agreements so that our interests also are considered. This briefly about the industrialization and investment policy, but also we can discuss the question of what kind of social policy we have, right? So it means that we need to think more about education. I mentioned that the teacher's position is a least paid job in Georgia, and we need a massive investment also in those sectors as well. And also, we don't have a minimum wage in Georgia. We frequently say that we want to become a part of the European Union, but we don't want to learn the part of the European Union which is kind of could be beneficial to, right? So labor rights, minimum wage, and those policies which benefits workers. So this is a second part. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, there is no any conversation, any debate about political. If we look at the political program, major party in Georgian Dream, we would not see any kind of this kind of mentions of industrial policy or minimum wage or this kind of policies. And same applies to all opposition parties. And even if they have something in their programs, it's kind of only for political reasons. And these are very vaguely and superficially discussed. For instance, the issue of now, the problem in Georgia is that the left socialist groups are really disorganized, and actually this is not the problem of Georgia only, but it's kind of the same around the world. But I think it will be very important in the future that we need to bring those issues which I mentioned today, those of industrialization and those of social policy issues back to the public discourse. Otherwise, we will be always entrenched in this false dichotomy between the West and the East, and we only discussing question of foreign policy. And this is really dangerous in the long term.
Zilo bagi, to isto svērstmos. Izsaušana